In the wake of the Liberal victory in Canada's recent election, the Canadian Conservative stronghold of Alberta is lashing out and seeking satisfaction in or out of this arrangement, which many in the province fear will spell a death blow for Alberta's interests. This is manifest most significantly in a bill which would considerably alter the election process, though Alberta's premier has claimed that this has been in the works even prior to the election. This included some basic reforms like simplifying ballots to prevent confusion, banning electronic vote counting machines, enhancing voter ID requirements, and changes to spending regulations, but the most interesting detail in the bill is a proposal that would make it far easier for citizens to trigger recalls and initiatives, namely extending deadlines and lowering the number of signatures needed. Why this matters, of course, is because it would make it easier for Albertans to remove politicians from office, as well as launch initiatives like, say, an independence referendum. This has captured the imagination of several Albertans, further fueled by the earlier rhetoric of US President Donald Trump that he intended to make Canada the 51st state, with some Albertans now hoping that Alberta alone could be the 51st state. Albertan independence and potential statehood is a lot more complicated than recent discussions are making it seem, however. There are very evident hang-ups for all parties and players which may produce a very different outcome and which genuinely could determine whether Canada will evaporate as a country or potentially rise to new heights. Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another video for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this on history and politics every week, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned. As I said, there's a very noisy narrative circulating right now that would have many of us believe that Alberta's future is a clear-cut thing. America is much stronger than Canada, America under Trump wants land from Canada, Alberta wants to be free from Canada, win-win-win, right? It's not that simple, and there's a lot of bias on various sides of the argument. That brings me to the sponsor of today's video, Ground News, because they help cut through the noise and bias in political coverage. If you've seen any of my videos on recent politics, chances are I've used Ground News to help me research the topic. In case anyone watching isn't familiar, Ground News is a website and app that compiles news stories from across the internet and summarizes key details from them while providing insight on the reliability and political leanings of these news sources. It's practical and efficient. Ground News gathers all these articles and lets you launch a deeper investigation into the topic by comparing the headlines side by side. You can see here just from the headlines the right-leaning sources are really trying to hone in on public dissatisfaction with Canada itself, while the left-leaning sources are framing this as a simple reaction to an undesired election outcome. If you've never tried it before, now's your chance to give it a shot and get unlimited access at 40% off of their Vantage plan. Follow the link below at ground.news/mr.z or follow this QR code to subscribe to Ground News today. As I was working on this video, Trump has met with the Prime Minister of Canada, and to my delight, this meeting actually reaffirmed some of what I had speculated in this video. To my chagrin, however, I now felt compelled to add more to the script, so I wasn't just restating what was now very obvious. In that case, we'll start with the obvious. Is all of Canada going to become the 51st state or see annexation into the United States? No, nor would it be ideal for either party. I've spoken about this at great length in this video here, but in short, an acquisition of Canada is nothing like an acquisition of Greenland or the Panama Canal. You're talking about a land with a considerable population, significant political infrastructure, and all the baggage that comes with that. Greenland has a population of some 50 to 60,000 people, which is about 5% of the population of the New York City public school system. The Panama Canal Zone would have a population similar to that as well. Both of these would require very little management relative to the profit they could generate. While Canada is lucrative, it would take far more work to integrate it into the United States, not to mention the political headache it would create for Republicans no matter how you slice it. Funnily enough, you might draw a comparison to the British Empire and the American colonies. Should you fight for this large territory that clearly doesn't like you very much when you have, in Britain's case, the smaller sugar colonies, which are far easier to manage and much more lucrative? Better to settle a peace and work out an economic partnership with this bigger country. That way their internal management is their problem, not yours, and you can still reap the economic benefits. Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, during that meeting with Trump made explicitly clear during a very civil discussion, mind you, that Canada was not for sale, and Trump affirmed that friendship with Canada was more important than compelling Canada into a union. But on the matter of a peaceful union, Trump did say never, clearly leaving the possibility and opportunity open for the future, but stepping back from his more pugnacious rhetoric. So Trump isn't going to forcibly annex all of Canada, and right now Canada's government does not want to willingly join the United States. But Canada isn't out of the boiler just yet. While the Canadians officially asserted their sovereignty from the US and Trump appears ready to respect that, there are populations within Canada that feel otherwise, most vocally, recently being the Albertans. Alberta as a province has had aspirations for independence for almost as long as it has existed. Naturally, this is complicated by the fact that Alberta is landlocked, and if not by Canada, would almost certainly fall under the influence of the United States, with whom it finds closer kinship in some regards, most obviously in trade and interdependence. Alberta is very resource-rich, a very significant producer of hydrocarbons, namely oil and natural gas. As an independent country, it would hold access to the third largest proven oil reserve in the world. The US, as you might imagine, is very fond of oil and makes great use of it to fuel everything from transportation to production. Canada not only having a far smaller population than the US, but also taking major steps over the years to reduce its carbon footprint, doesn't make use of Alberta's resources in a way which is satisfactory to the province. For many Albertans, there is a sense that, yes, Canada is holding the province back from fully exploiting this natural richness and building a powerful economy, but at the same time, Canada does exploit Alberta's mineral wealth, selling this oil off and then redistributing that wealth to economically less productive provinces through equalization payments, which largely favor the eastern states at the expense of the western states. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm sure someone's going to correct me in the comments. Provinces. The eastern provinces at the expense of the western provinces. They're states. Hey, they're some type of denomination of sub-federal entity. With pipeline projects shut down, Canada having remarkably little infrastructure in its interior, and Alberta being closer to large population centers in the US than it is to those in Canada, the Albertans feel disengaged from Canadian trade and cooperation, and in some ways feel the US acts as a better partner who is actually interested in buying and developing their resources. Politically, there's also a divergence of interest between Alberta and the rest of the country, primarily the coastal regions which dominate politics. Alberta, though not conservative in the same vein as American conservatism, is a stronghold of Canadian conservatism, opposing environmental regulation and gun control. Keep in mind as well, this pales in comparison to American opposition to gun control, which is backed by constitutional right. For Albertans and other rural Canadians, access to firearms appears to be more a matter of practicality, essentially saying, hey, we live out in the most rugged part of the country. There are bear, cougar, and wolverines out here, so we need something to protect ourselves with and hunt with. The Albertans seem to be perfectly content with thorough background checks, licensing laws, and general gun regulations, but the real fear is the Canadian government outright banning or seizing them in a fashion similar to what other Anglo countries like Britain, Australia, or New Zealand have done. Albertans look to the United States with its far laxer laws as a haven for these shared values, but not often discussed is what Alberta and Canada both do value in which the US does not, namely universal or single-payer health care, strong welfare systems, and of course, this is a big one, multiculturalism. Like the other Anglosphere countries and in stark contrast to the United States, even Canadian conservatives have largely embraced pro-diversity views as part of their mainstream platform. There are all manner of factors. The Canadians have made this a little bit of their identity for a couple decades by this point. But what probably speaks more to the conservative Canadians is this idea that they're underpopulated and they need more workers from abroad. Nevertheless, these differences remain a sticking point for Alberta and the rest of Canada, with Albertans increasingly feeling as though their votes and voices do not matter to the rest of the country. This is compounded by what appears to be deteriorating relations between the US and Canada, which would further impact Alberta's economy given how important the US is to its resource sector. So now the question many are asking is, will Alberta secede from Canada? Before answering that, let's quickly consider what it would mean for the country. In short, disaster. Albertan independence would cripple Canada's domestic energy sector. Yes, it is underused right now, but at least it is there and can be drawn upon in a time of crisis. But if Alberta is truly gone, it takes with it not 50%, not 75%, but 90% of Canada's proven oil supply. The Canadians would be about as resource-rich as their tiny overseas motherland of Great Britain without Alberta. There's also the question of infrastructure. With Alberta independent, Canadians would now be dependent upon Alberta's goodwill to traverse the two roads and one railway that connects the east to the west. Air travel remains an option, but this would cripple Canada logistically since carrying massive amounts of cargo by air is far less practical than by rail. On a long enough timeline, this essentially guarantees that British Columbia would also seek independence for the sake of better managing its local governance and trade, but would almost certainly remain friendly with Canada proper. The real issue is the message Albertan independence would send to other provinces, and things just get worse from there. Saskatchewan, Alberta's neighbor, has suggested that if Alberta succeeds in gaining independence, it would follow suit. Quebec remains another province with ambitions for independence, still boasting a population of 30 to 40% in support today, comparable to the level of support seen in Alberta. Quebec, however, has a sweet deal with Canada in that it retains a major degree of autonomy and still benefits from the combined Canadian economy. If, however, Canada were dealt a major blow in losing their lucrative province of Alberta, the double economic and moral impact of this loss would be sufficient to motivate a new push for Quebec independence. Quebec's independence would negatively impact the maritime province's abilities to engage with Ontario and Manitoba, and it's not out of the realm of possibility that they may feel compelled to pursue independence as well, if for no other reason than to better manage their local politics, independent of the disconnected Ontario. Essentially, Alberta could be the first domino to fall and set off this chain reaction that leaves Canada terribly divided, and it would ultimately be for the worse. Landlocked Alberta would, as I said earlier, most certainly fall under the sway of the United States, but with only 20% of Alberta's population supporting statehood, this would be something they do very begrudgingly, probably establishing a union with Saskatchewan first in hopes of boosting their viability as an independent power. British Columbia would likely be eyed by the United States as well to bridge the gap between the contiguous states and Alaska. With the British Columbians even more resistant to American annexation than Alberta, it's not out of the realm of possibility that China may fill the role of primary trade partner and use BC as a tool against the US, much as the US has used Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines to encroach upon China's domain. Quebec would be reeling economically, continuing to be dependent upon Canada and the US for trade, but no longer reaping the economic benefits of the Union. The EU, and France in particular, might seize upon the opportunity to re-establish a major foothold in North America, incorporating Quebec into the EU or France itself to provide Quebec some economic security while also allowing the Europeans to check the United States more closely. Similar might be said of the Maritimes if they're not swept up by the US first. It's not a pretty picture for Canada, any of the provinces except maybe Quebec, nor the United States. Canada becomes relegated to a tertiary power in the global order, America's security is compromised by the fragmentation of their northern neighbor, and various provinces are either worse off economically or dependencies of another country. So how possible is it that Alberta will break away and set off this sequence of events? Well, fortunately for North America, it's unlikely Alberta will be going anywhere anytime soon. Alberta cannot declare unilateral independence, nor does it seem to have the desire to do that right now. It really looks like the Albertans want to run through the proper legal process to secede from Canada, or rather use this to cajole a better agreement within the Union, not outside of it, and I'll give some more insight on that in just a moment. First, what is the legal process for a province to secede? Quebec essentially set the standard for that when the Clarity Act was passed. There must be a referendum with a clear question for independence. There must be a clear majority in support. Then negotiations need to be held between the province, the federal government, the other provinces, and the First Nations inhabiting the seceding province. If everyone agrees, the final authorization needs to be made by unanimous vote in the House of Commons, a majority in the Senate, and 2/3 of the provinces. As you might imagine, this would take quite a bit of time. It's structured a little bit like an old-fashioned divorce proceeding, which gives the parties plenty of time to reconsider and discuss their differences before deciding if this is something they really want to do, except in this case there's more than just two parties, which further complicates the matter. The First Nations chiefs have been very vocal that they will not support secession. Canada has 10 provinces, meaning you would need at least 6 to hit that 2/3 support for Albertan independence. Alberta is a given, but let's assume they're not factored in, so you need 6 out of 9. Saskatchewan, Quebec, maybe Manitoba could be expected to support the measure. We could be generous and say even British Columbia votes in favor as well. Even if we were to include Alberta, that would still be shy of the 2/3 vote needed. Realistically, the chances of Alberta gaining independence through this method are looking very slim. Well, what if they just do it? The system fails, so they go the route of unilateral independence anyway. Again, they can't really do that. Canada would easily compel them back into the Union. Well, what if the US supports Alberta, or just outright annexes them? This here is something that was reaffirmed to me by Trump meeting with Carney. American friendship with Canada is seen as much more important than annexing any of the provinces. I think Trump recognizes that compelling Canada into annexation would just cause more problems for the US. Alberta comes with its own hassle as well, because not only would you be annexing it against Canada's wishes and enraging them, but logistically you're essentially expanding the US border with Canada by a length near equal to the entire US-Mexico border. That's a border that's going to need to be defended, secured, patrolled. A lot of land in the far north isn't even populated or developed. If terrorists or spies wanted to sneak into the United States, or criminals escape out of the United States, this massive expanse of wilderness is a huge hole in America's defenses. And insofar as terrorists or spies are concerned, this is a straight pathway down to a lot of America's nuclear weapon facilities. Yes, the US could just march in and recognize Albertan sovereignty or outright annex the region, but it wouldn't be worth it in the grand scheme of things. As I said earlier, doing this runs a great risk of destabilizing Canada as a whole, which is going to bring much more trouble for the US. The most realistic scenario I see playing out, what I believe is actually unfolding before us, is a strategy of compromise. Alberta is aiming high and grandstanding on potential independence, using this opportunity to remind Canadians how much they contribute and how much more they still have to offer, because what they really want is a unique role in Canada. Alberta's premier made this clear enough when she was running for office. She says she wants to change Alberta's relationship with Ottawa, advocating for Alberta's sovereignty within a united Canada, not independence, but much of the same local freedom afforded to Quebec. The Alberta Sovereignty within a United Canada Act is an interesting move that went into force in 2022. For anyone familiar with US history, it's somewhat reminiscent to what many of the nullifiers had advocated for during Jackson's presidency. It would essentially allow Alberta to opt out of or refuse to enforce any Canadian federal law or policy it saw as unconstitutional or harmful to Alberta itself. This is some very vague and wide-reaching language because it almost seems to give Alberta carte blanche to operate without regard for federal policy. Saskatchewan passed a similar measure asserting its autonomy as well, but so far Alberta hasn't done very much with this act, and it appears to be facing challenges that if ever were used, its constitutionality may be in question. Plainly, so far it seems more like a symbolic measure that hasn't been put into real practice. What Alberta wants more than anything else is, one, to be able to fully exploit and profit off of its natural resources, and two, to have security against any perceived overreach from the Canadian government to preserve its local way of life. The Albertans probably wouldn't mind the equalization payments as much, or at least contributing more to the economy, if they were allowed to actually reach their full potential and make the province wealthier before sending money elsewhere. There's a big complaint from Albertans that Quebec gets so much from equalization payments despite having a high GDP, but that's because Quebec has opted out of several federal programs. It's basically getting grant money to use however it likes, instead of seeing that invested in the services that other provinces receive. Alberta could certainly arrange for the same deal, but they'd probably just reinvest into the same services they're already getting. The power to opt out of certain environmental policies is going to be a big one too, but this is probably better handled through negotiating a long-term arrangement with the federal government, since the federal government will likely have a big role to play in developing any pipelines and major energy infrastructure. Unless they go another route. Alberta could assume a unique role. Again, with 90% of the country's proven oil reserve, they could be given proportional sway in votes and decisions relating to oil exploitation, pipeline construction, and not to mention an exception from the carbon tax. Like, if you're contributing 90% to the country's energy resources, you should probably have a majority stake and say in how those resources are being used. Hand in hand with this, they'd probably also want the ability to collect and manage their own taxes in the same vein as Quebec, just to give them that extra control over their own finances. Perhaps not opting out of the Canadian education system, but having more control over their curriculum would probably be expected to be another aim as well. Quebec has this as a given on account of their unique culture and language, but Alberta may want to do so for the sake of moving away from the more liberal and Ontario-focused perspective to concentrate on more practical education, perhaps even gearing it toward trades that would be useful in the province. Law enforcement will be another huge factor. Distrust of Ontario is going to go hand in hand with Albertans distrusting the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to enforce Albertan over Canadian laws. We could probably expect them to establish their own provincial police force like Quebec and, ironically, Ontario, who has the Ontario Provincial Police. More control over immigration, like Quebec, is basically a given, but that doesn't necessarily mean Alberta wants much less immigration. But they do want to control how immigration to Alberta works. They want more laborers, they want these laborers settling in more rural areas, not in already overpopulated cities, and of course they want to vet them to ensure these immigrants aren't criminals or individuals who are going to be a strain on the province. The end goal for Alberta, given all these factors in play, is likely to achieve an equal level of autonomy to Quebec, as well as be given authority over Canadian energy policy because of its unique role as the overwhelming energy producer in the country. I think the Canadian Prime Minister may be more receptive to this than others give him credit for. Yes, he has adopted a hardcore position on climate policy in the past, however, that idealism is clashing with the new reality, and Canada cannot afford to be idealistic anymore. It must strive to be a capable power who can pull more of its own weight in defense. As Carney said during his meeting with Trump, it must become less reliant on American fuel and become an energy superpower. Carney said this right before the election, not just an energy superpower, quote, the world's leading energy superpower. With competition like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, that's not an unrealistic goal if Carney is willing to unleash what Alberta is capable of doing. What did he say in the same speech? We must develop both clean energy and our carbon conventional energy. A deal between Carney and Alberta is absolutely realistic. In fact, it's very likely. Simple fact is Alberta is a leader in the Canadian Federation, which has long been dominated by the two leaders of Ontario and Quebec. Alberta will not break away, but will join rank with these two on equal footing and will work to further the interests of like-minded communities in provinces like Saskatchewan and in the frontiers of British Columbia. Will the US end up with some Canadian land by the end of this? I also wouldn't rule that out, though I think the mistake is looking to the heavily peopled provinces along our northern border. What we want is more land, not more people, and especially land with resource value and strategic use. That's why I believe the wisest move for the United States would be the annexation not of Canada's provinces, but its territories to forge a greater Alaska, and you can learn more about why that is in this video here. Thank you all for watching, be sure to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.